Okay, so we left off talking about the physical attributes of this woman that's being depicted in both John White's original painting and de Brye's engraving that came a little bit later. We're talking about sort of the physicality of the woman, how she's been changed in the engraving on the right-hand side by de Brye. She's a bit more muscular in her arms and her legs. There was a sense that there was sort of a brute strength, if you will, about Native American peoples that's being depicted by de Brye that isn't necessarily coming across in John White's original. We can also see that the child looks quite significantly different in the engraving. We see that the child is a bit taller, a bit older, again, a bit more muscular and stronger. She's also holding not only a European dressed doll that must have been given to her by an Englishman who came to visit the village, but also a very intricate looking rattle in the other hand as well. So we see these differences that are being projected. Are there any other differences that you can notice in the picture as well? And what do you think that that says about the impression that English people had initially about Native Americans and how that image was being repackaged and then sold to the rest of Europe as it was published in books about the New World? John White's images and Debray's engravings weren't the only images that came out by English people of what they saw in the New World. John Smith was a very, very significant player in the way that Europeans saw Native Americans. And this happened largely because John Smith thought himself very much a adventurous man. He was a mercenary soldier. He sold his services as a soldier to not only the English, but other countries as well. He worked with Dutch and several others throughout his lifetime. But it is his encounter with Pocahontas in the New World that we're most familiar with as Americans because the story has come down through to us through his History of Virginia. So we can see then an image, an engraved image from his published history that was produced from his journals on the left-hand side of the slide. In the caption, it says, "King Powhatan commands Captain Smith to be slain. His daughter Pocahontas begs for his life," etc. So you can see that he sort of has his head laid on a chopping block, and there's a man just to the left of the block who has a club. Actually, two of them have clubs raised above their heads, ready to strike. And then there's a small, almost child-looking figure with a bow and arrow speaking to a very larger-than-life figure who is Powhatan, asking for him to be spared. So John Smith makes out this story to be very heroic and very romantic, and the story has been so very, very, very romanticized over the years. Anthropologists have since looked back at this particular incident and matched up John Smith's account of what happened with what were the practices of Algonquian peoples like Powhatans in their ceremonies. And it's believed by many anthropologists now that the ceremony that John Smith was taking part in was an induction ceremony. What Powhatan was doing in the ceremony was to demonstrate his power over life and death to John Smith, to allow him to see that he was a powerful king and that John Smith would be indebted to Powhatan for his very life, and that John Smith then would become a tributary to Powhatan's tribe, that he would become sort of an underking under Powhatan's rule. Now, this has all been lost in the retelling and the retelling of this story. We do know, though, that the romantic element that is usually told is fairly untrue. Pocahontas herself was quite young. She could have been as young as between 12 and 14 years old. No one knows exactly for sure, but she was a young girl. And she did not, in fact, marry John Smith after the fact. She ended up staying in America after John Smith left to go on other adventures and other explorations. And then another colonist, prominent colonist, came to Virginia, and his name was John Rolfe. And John Rolfe came with the first significant shipment of tobacco that really saved the Jamestown colony from ruination. He becomes very prominent. Pocahontas is actually kidnapped from her home and brought to Jamestown as a captive, really for ransom, to try to get Powhatan to trade with Jamestown. While she's held captive in Jamestown, she is taught the English language, she is converted to Christianity, and she actually does end up marrying John Rolfe, and they have a child together, a son. They take a trip to England because Pocahontas herself is asked to be seen at court in the court of James I. And so Pocahontas travels all the way across to England to be seen in the court while her husband has to wait outside because he's a commoner. But shortly after she's seen by the king, and the couple are preparing to return to England, on the ship that's ready to depart, Pocahontas catches an illness and dies. So she was never able to return to England. Nevertheless, the story does come down to us in various formats, and we're going to look at a couple of those. Again, looking at images, let's take a look at what kinds of images have been produced in America over the years about the story and the myth of Pocahontas. We've got the early engraving from the first history in 1632. In the Victorian period, in the mid-1800s, you have a very, very colorful, romanticized depiction of Native Americans in the moment that Pocahontas saves John Smith. Then, a few years further on in the 20th century, we've got a 1950s version when cowboys and Indians become outrageously popular after Walt Disney's um, Davy Crockett series is put onto TV. Then, a bit later, 1995, you're probably all most familiar with the Disney version of Pocahontas, the animated version. You can actually click on the URL link there and have a look at the depiction of that moment when Pocahontas lays her head on John Smith's head and saves him. Now, I want you to view that and then compare it to the 2005 Terrence Malick version called The New World. Click on the YouTube link there as well and watch the same moment of the story where Pocahontas saves John Smith depicted. What are the similarities and differences that you see here? Of course, we do still see a romantic story being depicted by both of these, but what can we say about some of the realism and the depictions of Native Americans in each of these two films? The next form of contact I want to talk about is European and Native American warfare. There were very distinct cultural differences between waging war on the Native American side and European side of things. Native Americans tended to fight with Europeans for territory and incursions and for not holding up trade agreements through various different small skirmishes. They would rush in, have a skirmish, and retreat, versus a very much different approach by Europeans, which was a total war, a burnt ground policy that would, in most cases, try to either exterminate or the people or the land surrounding Native American villages. Here you have an example of what one English colonist took as their approach to warfare with Native Americans. A significant example of warfare that happened was in Jamestown in 1622. Natives were really seeking to get rid of the English in their particular area because there had been many disagreements about provisions of food and hunting grounds. In the attack that happened in 1692, Native Americans snuck in for an attack on on the colonists, I should say. And they surprised and attacked the village, killing 347 English men, women, and children. This form of total war was then returned on Native Americans by the English over the next 7 years. Much like the Spanish, another means of conquest was a biological kind of warfare, which we call the virgin soil epidemic. This means that there were certain diseases that were carried by Europeans that Native Americans really had no immunity to. And in fact, there was a virgin soil epidemic that killed many Native Americans just prior to Puritans settling in New England. In fact, there were many deaths of Indians in 1616, right before the landing in 1620 in Plymouth of many English colonists. Their deaths, Native American deaths, were often given a theological justification. In fact, one colonist noted God was angry with them, speaking of Native Americans, for their wickedness and would destroy them and give their country to another people that should not live as beasts as they did, but should be clothed. This concept of the savagery of Native Americans would be held by many Puritans. In fact, instead of viewing the pre-colonial landscape of America as beautiful, the leading Puritans perceived, in William Bradford's phrase, a hideous and desolate wilderness full of beasts and wild men. Wild beasts and wild men were used as parallels. The wilderness was seen as inherently evil, as well as Native Americans being seen as pagan and without God, without the one true God, that is. And the New Englanders saw the Indians as essentially their opposites. Suspecting that the wilderness was seductive as well as evil, Puritan leaders also feared that their own people would degenerate into Indians from prolonged contact with Native American ways and Native American lands. So they were very much on their guard against Native Americans and really did try as much as possible to isolate themselves from contact with Native Americans. In two ways, the English labored to reassure themselves that they remained civilized Christians and resisted the temptations of an Indian life. First, by changing the land and pulling down and clearing many trees, and secondly, by converting the Indians. But this only really happened quite late and in limited ways, which we'll look at briefly. But they also held very different concepts of land and land ownership. Status was achieved for English people through ownership of property, and natives were sort of seen as lazy and idle and not using their land to its fullest potential. And so this was a way that much of the land in New England was taken or justified to be taken by English people. The Pequot War in 1636 and then later King Philip's War in 1675 were major conflicts between Native Americans and Puritans of New England, in which total war was again used on both sides of the fence. In the Pequot War, one Englishman said that the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the praise thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. In many ways, God was seen to be on the side of Puritans, and the Bible Commonwealth was under attack by pagans, and this was the paradigm under which they fought. Within this time, there were some limited attempts to evangelize Native Americans, mostly coming from John Eliot, who was called the Apostle of the Indians in 1650, and established praying towns of converted Indians who did actually not only take on Christianity, but were also civilized into European culture as well as taking on the Christian religion. Ultimately, the final debate about the view that existed between Europeans and Native Americans comes down to a few designations. There was a faith designation between